Girl is cornered by hooligans but saved by a ghost. The streets of Hong Kong had always been crowded and noisy, but tonight they felt hauntingly silent. Song Ling, an 18-year-old university student, hurried through the narrow alley, her heart pounding with every step. She had taken this shortcut many times before, but tonight felt different. The street was unusually quiet, and a creeping sensation of being followed gnawed at her. Out of the shadows, two hooligans emerged, their faces twisted into sneers and their clothes tattered. "Well, what do we have here?" one of them said, his eyes narrowing as they scanned her up and down. Ling felt a surge of panic. She backed away, clutching her bag tightly. Before she could react, one of the men lunged toward her. Ling screamed and resisted with all her strength, but she was overpowered. One of the hooligans raised his hand to strike her when suddenly he froze, his face contorting in terror. Both men stared at something behind Ling. Without a word, they bolted, leaving her standing alone in the dimly lit alley. Ling turned and briefly glimpsed a hideous figure before it disappeared into the shadows. Trembling, she gathered her things and ran home, her mind racing with fear and confusion. When Ling reached home, she burst through the door, her breath ragged. "Mom!" she called, her voice shaking. Her mother, a woman in her early 40s, hurried from the kitchen. "Ling, what happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Ling recounted the terrifying encounter with the hooligans and the hideous figure she glimpsed in the alley. Her mother, wide-eyed, embraced her tightly. "Thank goodness you're safe," she whispered. After a moment, she pulled back and looked at Ling seriously. "You shouldn't walk down that alley again. Avoid those hooligans and that eerie figure. Go to bed early tonight. You have an interview in the morning." Ling nodded, though her mind was still filled with the events of the night. The next day, Ling went for her interview at a high-rise building. She performed well, but as she and the other candidates were leaving, a loud fire alarm blared throughout the building. Panic erupted. Employees and visitors scrambled for the exits as smoke started filling the hallways. Ling joined the crowd, but as they descended the stairwell, the fire intensified, cutting off their escape. Ling and a small group of people were forced into an office room, the heat growing unbearable as they awaited rescue. She coughed violently, gasping for air, and then she saw it. In the corner of the room, the eerie figure from the alley stood, its dark silhouette unwavering despite the chaos. It was watching her, not moving, just waiting. Ling's pulse raced. "Who are you? Stop following me!" she screamed, her voice piercing through the din. Was this real? Or was it the smoke playing tricks on her mind? She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her vision, but the figure remained, looming in the corner, watching with unblinking eyes. It was as though time slowed, and the fire itself seemed to curl away from the figure, leaving it untouched. She screamed, backing against the wall, just as the firemen burst into the room. The figure vanished in the blink of an eye. The firemen pulled Ling and the others to safety. As they escorted her out, one of the firemen turned to his colleague. "Did you see that man in there? He led us right to her." His colleague shook his head. "What man? There wasn't anyone else." The firemen were baffled, but Ling couldn't focus on their words. She was too overwhelmed with relief. She was alive, but something about the encounter lingered in her mind. Who was that figure in the flames? Ling's mother visited her at the hospital after her checkup, hugging her tightly, tears of relief streaming down her face. "I was so scared, Ling. I thought I lost you." "I'm okay, Mom," Ling reassured her, though the mysterious figure from the fire remained at the back of her thoughts. After she was discharged, her mother insisted they go to the temple to pray for her safety. The next day, Ling and her mother went to a nearby Buddhist temple. They knelt in prayer, asking for protection and guidance. As they were about to leave, the Reverend, an elderly monk, passed by them, his eyes fixed on the temple's entrance. He paused and stood still, as if seeing something they couldn't. Ling and her mother watched as the Reverend began mumbling softly, shaking his head. His voice, barely audible, said, "It's time to let go and return to where you belong." Confused, Ling and her mother exchanged glances. The Reverend then turned and walked over to them, his expression somber. "Your father, Mun Long, was here. He asked me to tell you that he loves you both dearly and that he's relieved Ling is safe from this fire disaster, but now it's time for him to go." Ling and her mother stood frozen, tears welling in their eyes. The name echoed in Ling's mind, reverberating with memories she never had but always felt. "Mun Long," she whispered, a tremor in her voice as her mother clutched her hand tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. It had been years since they'd heard his name spoken aloud. He had been a sailor, lost at sea when his ship sank, presumed dead when Ling was only 1 year old. Her mother had raised her alone, never remarrying, always telling Ling that her father had loved them deeply. And now, they knew the truth. He had never truly left them. The Reverend paused for a moment, his gaze softening as he looked at Ling. "And Ling," he added gently, "your father also wanted me to remind you, next time, don't use the dark alley." Ling's heart skipped a beat. The message was clear, and it hit her with a chilling realization. Her father had been watching over her all along, guiding her even in the shadows. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I won't." At that moment, the weight of all those years came crashing down on them. Ling and her mother broke down, the tears flowing freely. The spirit that had protected Ling saved her from the hooligans and led the firemen to her. It had been her father all along, watching over her in the shadows. The fear that had once gripped Ling melted away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of love and sorrow. Her father's spirit, after all these years, had finally found peace.